I should probably clean up some of the things because they lend themselves to be targeted by the sort of the the so-called Marxist narrative. So in some of mine talking about how the surplus value which is going to the capitalists, that it's not it's not necessarily correct to just reduce that to blanket exploitation. Um, and obviously, when I make that claim and say, well, if you just look at history and if you look at the actual quality of life of the population and how it's increased, there are at least obvious pointers at which uh, it seems like an abstract concern to complain about the ownership of the means of production, um, when access essentially to goods and services is generally increasing within the population, even as inequality continues. So there's this way in which, well, even if if that trend continues, so what? Essentially, and I think that there is a kind of mathematical fallacy that sort of is used to sort of, well, if wealth continues to be concentrated, uh, it means that the market itself is going to be warped towards the holders of wealth, but that's not true. Um, and in fact, I think that also the financialization of a lot of the economy uh, makes the active part of the economy the sort of much more important, because all the mathematical models require at least some kind of so I mean, it's interesting, but as soon as, let's say, capitalism as a whole stops being able to actually expand its delivery of services to consumers, um, the whole thing will pretty much collapse and implode at that point, in almost financial terms. So the system is actually predicated. The continuance of the system seems to be predicated on the fact that it will continue to concentrate wealth, but that seems to be that it is an irrelevant feature of the system, because that exploitation of in terms of the concentration of the ownership of the means of production is only allowed and is only permitted in exchange for essentially the control of or at least the command value that is placed by consumers on that means of production, and meeting those desires and expectations of consumers, and creating an extra access to consumers. And all the people who have more money than they can ever dispose of in their lifetime, that they're not part of that. It's not pertinent. It might as well not belong in the system. Um, okay. Anyway, so this general complaint that people that have too much money for themselves somehow like pollute everything else. Um, I think that is pretty much a fallacy in some sense. But anyway. Yeah, so I mean, if you do even, and I don't like making this defense, because this defense is just as sort of vague and nebulous as it is as is the counterclaim that I'm arguing against. But I'm basically saying that if you want to generalize it, that, let's say, the proletarian as a class are getting more from allowing themselves to have their surplus value, uh, and it's almost by definition they are, because otherwise they would um, be patrons of different places, and so you have to have so much of a kind of generalized idealization of compulsion in the system, which simply does not exist in at least the Western model of these things. you start off by infantilizing people and the citizenry to such a high degree to even get a lot of the stuff off the ground, that that this lowest common denominator proletarian will just always have an unfair existence because other people own the means of production, and that is the nexus of their problem in their life. And it's such a cop out. It's such an abject, many people will have issues in their lives, and it has nothing to do essentially with their relation to the means of production. It perhaps has to do with many other factors, and which have to do with many things. And there is this problem in sort of oversimplifying life down to the level at which Marxist ideology seems to penetrate problems and offer solutions, which again I think it doesn't. It is the symptom of something, and it can indirectly, whatever it is the symptom of, can is not going to be tackled by combating this symptom of the means of production. Although it gives you some vague understanding of sociological themes, but to think that sociology is something that humans have to interface with through politics or interpersonally is a hideous form of totalitarian sort of gainsaying. It just becomes a sort of a it's not going to work out. But okay, wait, let me think. There were other points now that I wanted to raise on this. So yeah, you see, it only gets away with itself because it keeps on referring to this generalized lowest common denominator experience of the proletarian. And I mean, one of the biggest parts of the Marxist hypothesis in terms of the end of capitalism is essentially that people get thrown out of work. It's interesting though, because I would say that a lot of that sort of thing is only occurring because of the state, the inefficiency of the state, and the corruption of the state in general, colluding with certain forms of business as well. But I mean, capitalism as itself has always been a very strange system, because if you ever have it in its pure form, it seems that it doesn't sort of too many people go for the mousetrap and they invalidate each other. It needs some level of coordination. It needs some sort of transparency, at least on some level, which is technically anti-capitalistic in the sense that it sort of seems to promote some kind of cartel coordination, just so that certain industries at least aren't overcapitalized. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that has made capitalism work for humanity, and these are all things that are not fixed features objectively, that they might disappear. And what we are suffering from in terms of capitalism is actually not the failure of capitalism, it's the failure of the accelerated increase of capitalism that we have lived through. And this has already been explored by academics, that it's that growth is no longer growing exponentially, essentially, but capitalism still offers far better growth than Russia ever did under Stalin or anyone. And okay, so yeah, but generally the thing is that because of innovation and technological innovation, capital doesn't conserve itself that well. There are people that fall out of the 1%. And although they can sort of set themselves up so that they're actually no longer risking anything and they're just taking sort of the safe bet or whatever, but I mean, uh, at some point something gets invested, and you can say that they've got enough advisors doing things for them or whatever, but uh, essentially capital is risk. There are risks attached to capital, at least if you have a certain maintained framework in which competitors aren't just killed by oligarchs and plutocrats, aren't just coming in and sort of stopping competition from occurring. But just because of innovation, that has generally allowed people to get in the elevator, as it were. And this even and because of that, the changes from innovation, even if you aren't directly the innovators themselves, just because of technological innovation, that usually provides a whole plethora of opportunity that cuts right across socioeconomic society. And so there are often enough things happening that are different, that actually have an edge over the things that already exist, that there are opportunities essentially to have social mobility. And as long as there, I would say, is access to ownership of the means of production, although that it's hard to see how that even relates to certain industries that essentially don't produce or they produce intellectual property. They don't produce products. So you've got but yeah. So I mean, there is usually enough change in the system and sort of volatility in general, which means that there is a lot of efficiency. I mean, a lot of this has depleted because, notoriously, capitalistic systems can scale production and they can distribute product like nothing else. But what they can't do essentially is do long-term R&D. They business models are not set up to do that, and they're not set up to do the kind of research which is a kind of broad-based platform and support system. But to have a state sector, you could say that also. In the kind of system that we have, in which the state is tasked or has a duty to ensure a level of sort of equal opportunity, or at least to promote access and to facilitate access. Which is itself can be even a hazard to some degree, because if you employ essentially you can create perverse incentives in creating enabling policy that promotes culture that is that promotes a culture that is sort of incapable of cleaning up after itself. It's incapable of judging itself, or at least because it's alienated from the consequences of its own actions, because those consequences are ameliorated by state policy. And so it is problematic when you have a state that is essentially subsidizing bad decisions. Or at least a state that is not invested into understanding, not the history of these things, but how they continue to occur, and taking active steps to sort of do something about that, rather than being kind of a blind reactionary component of that ends up sort of enabling and subsidizing and facilitating more of the kind of cultural decay. Which is usually instantiated within some kind of meta-narrative or some kind of larger story which is being told. And so, sort of like blame and accountability just always gets outsourced. Which, sadly, Marxism is one of these facilitators to do that kind of gerrymandering, to sort of to ignore pragmatism, essentially, because you've got this grand story about how, well, obviously you can't expect things to go well because as a generalization, this group of people have this relationship to the ownership of the means of production. Yeah, and then just also substandard planning in terms of actually how to do the most good, as it were. I mean, in South Africa, for example, it would be much better if we had a stronger economy that would create opportunity and jobs, but that also then could have a sustainable tax base to invest. But I mean, a lot of the state investment is effectively plundered. Notoriously, school books were not delivered to schools almost in order to keep people undeveloped so that they could secure a rural voting bloc for the ruling party, for instance, in the Eastern Cape. And all of this, just feeds into the historical propaganda, essentially, or the historical narrative. Because the state essentially has no accountability for the success of its policy, or at least the inefficiency of its policy. Okay. But yeah, I mean, I guess this goes into the deeper question of the issue of fairness, the idea that, and it's such an ad hoc sort of application of fairness, that fairness somehow is grounded by everything has a reference to the ownership of the means of production. Like, where does the fairness come from? Where does it get paid for? As if we didn't already have a constitutional dispensation where the government is tasked with promoting access and extending access and increasing access to things. But instead of doing responsible policy with the funds that it has, it sort of creates this this very jerry-rigged, artificially retributivist, sort of factionalization in order to facilitate its ideological narrative, which, it just doesn't, it's not even helpful. It's not even, the policy itself is an abject failure. And then you get these people who just aggregate the trends as they read them according to their ideological framework, like this professor, which are effectively tailoring the narrative. which essentially begs the question,